Frank Lucas was nobody. He had no money, no connections, no power. Yet by the early 1970s, he would control Harlem's heroin trade like a king. He didn't inherit it, he didn't negotiate, he seized it. This is the story of how a boy from North Carolina became Harlem's most feared and admired kingpin. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you love true crime cases, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Frank Lucas was born in 1930 in La Grange, North Carolina. Life in the segregated South taught him early that power was conditional. Authority could punish arbitrarily. Survival depended on learning the invisible rules of the world. Frank became a keen observer. He studied people, patterns, and systems rather than relying on brute force. He realized that control was about understanding how things worked, not simply trying to dominate others. At 16, Frank stole money from his family and fled north. New York City, particularly Harlem, was dangerous. But for someone who understood systems, it was full of opportunity. He saw the city as structured chaos, a place where power was visible, concentrated, and predictable if studied carefully. Frank had nothing but an observant mind and a determination to survive. He began learning the rules of Harlem, quietly watching those who already held power. Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson was Harlem's king. Bumpy ruled with a mix of diplomacy and authority. He negotiated with the mafia, protected his neighborhood, and maintained order. Frank became his driver and confidant. From Bumpy, he learned critical lessons. Violence is expensive and unreliable. Loyalty is conditional. Knowledge is the key to power. But unlike Bumpy, Frank didn't want to inherit Harlem, he wanted to outsmart it. The Italian mafia controlled heroin in New York. Dealers and local gangs depended on intermediaries and wholesalers. Every shipment passed through mafia-controlled channels, and every decision was monitored. Frank noticed inefficiencies. Intermediaries reduced profits and purity. Violence slowed distribution. Hierarchies were rigid and exploitable. He realized that controlling supply, not guns or alliances, was the ultimate power. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died unexpectedly. The streets expected chaos. The mafia expected negotiation. Frank saw an opportunity. He didn't fight anyone. He didn't seek approval. Instead, he planned to control Harlem by controlling the product that everyone needed: heroin. Frank Lucas bypassed traditional supply chains entirely. During the Vietnam War, heroin shipments from Southeast Asia were abundant and often lightly inspected. Frank developed direct relationships with producers. He organized discreet shipments back to New York, often hiding drugs in furniture, crates, or equipment. The mafia had no access to these shipments. They had no ability to intervene. Frank branded his heroin blue magic. Purity was unmatched. Prices were lower than mafia-controlled heroin. Delivery was consistent. Dealers switched allegiance, not because of fear but because of profit. By the early 1970s, Frank had become Harlem's kingpin, quietly, efficiently, and without anyone realizing the scale of his rise. Frank Lucas's genius was that he didn't ask permission. He didn't attack rivals. He didn't negotiate. He simply offered a better system. Dependency replaced intimidation. Profit replaced tradition. Efficiency replaced violence. By the time the mafia realized what was happening, it was too late. Frank had rewritten the rules of Harlem's heroin trade. By the early 1970s, Frank Lucas had Harlem under control. Blue magic dominated street corners. Dealers, users, and distributors relied on him for quality, consistency, and profit. But Frank's vision extended beyond one neighborhood. He wanted to control heroin distribution across multiple cities, bypassing the mafia at every step. Expansion wasn't about ego, it was about dependency. Where supply flows, power follows. Frank's strategy for expansion was deliberate. Newark, New Jersey, close enough to Harlem to manage discreetly, far enough to avoid immediate mafia interference. Detroit, Michigan, high demand, limited organized crime oversight, ideal for replication of his Harlem system. He applied the same model everywhere. Secure direct supply from Southeast Asia. Train trusted couriers and distributors. Maintain consistent purity and delivery. Avoid unnecessary violence. The operation ran like a corporation, discreet, professional, and efficient. Everyone had a role. No one openly challenged him. Initially, the mafia ignored the shift. Dealers were still selling heroin. Territories seemed unchanged. Profits appeared steady. By the time they realized Frank had bypassed their network entirely, he had already solidified his influence. The streets no longer depended on the mafia. They depended on Frank Lucas. Frank's genius was subtlety. He didn't attack the mafia. He didn't steal shipments. He didn't insult bosses. Instead, he exploited inefficiencies, bypassed middlemen, and created a product that dealers could not refuse. Violence, the mafia's greatest tool, was rendered irrelevant. Blue magic was revolutionary. Unmatched purity, affordable pricing, reliable, consistent delivery. Dealers switched allegiance for economic reasons, not fear. Dependency replaced intimidation. Profit replaced tradition. Blue magic became the standard for heroin in Harlem. Frank expanded quietly. Harlem, base of operations. Newark, distribution hub. Detroit, replication point. Washington, D.C., secondary market. He operated without mafia permission, without alliances, and without open confrontation. Each city became an extension of his system. Frank controlled heroin distribution like a logistics company, not a street gang. The mafia relied on hierarchy, tradition, and violence. Approval required for every decision. Violence enforced loyalty. Supply chains were controlled through intermediaries. Frank exploited these weaknesses. He cut out middlemen. He followed market logic, not tradition. He responded faster than their rigid hierarchy could adapt. The mafia could not compete. With expansion came exposure. Large cash flows left traceable patterns. Shipment consistency attracted federal attention. Purity and profit remained unusually high. DEA, IRS, and local narcotics authorities began connecting the dots across cities. A single operator, Frank Lucas, was behind the flow. The efficiency that had defeated the mafia now drew the attention of the government. Frank's operations proved a fundamental truth. Street-level loyalty is transactional. Dealers value predictability. Users value quality. Profit dictates allegiance. By offering consistency, reliability, and financial advantage, Frank solidified his empire without firing a single shot. Even as his influence grew, vulnerabilities appeared. Couriers arrested. Shipments seized. Increased federal surveillance. The very system that made him powerful also made him visible. Law enforcement was patient, thorough, and systematic. Frank's empire was now in their sights. By the mid-1970s, the Italian mafia realized that their control over Harlem's heroin trade was slipping. Dealers were abandoning traditional suppliers. Profits from Harlem were disappearing into Frank Lucas's hands. Territories that had been secured for decades were quietly lost. They attempted to respond with familiar tactics: threats and intimidation, bribery and negotiation. Pressure on distributors. None of these strategies worked. Frank's network was too compartmentalized. Couriers operated discreetly. Information was controlled. The mafia could not identify the critical nodes of his operation, so they could not strike effectively. Frank's operation continued to grow. Newark thrived as a secondary hub. Detroit mirrored Harlem's efficiency. Washington, D.C. became another silent market. Each city replicated the same principles. Direct supply from Southeast Asia. Trusted, compartmentalized couriers. Predictable purity and delivery. Avoidance of violence. Dealers and users stayed loyal for a simple reason: consistent profit. Dependency replaced fear. Efficiency replaced hierarchy. Frank treated crime like a business. Efficiency reduces exposure. Compartmentalization limited risk. Branding Blue Magic ensured loyalty. Minimal violence kept law enforcement off balance temporarily. The mafia relied on intimidation. Frank relied on intelligence. He ran multiple cities without permission and without conflict, something no one had done before. Expansion brought visibility. Consistent shipments and high-purity heroin were unusual. Large amounts of cash raised red flags. Patterns across cities suggested centralized control. DEA agents, IRS investigators, and local narcotics officers began mapping the flow. Unlike the mafia, the government did not rely on fear. They relied on patience, evidence, and data. Frank's efficiency, which defeated the mafia, now created a new risk: exposure. Even with careful planning, cracks began to appear. Couriers were arrested or pressured to cooperate. Shipments were seized at ports and airports. Law enforcement began following cash flows. Frank responded quickly. Alternate shipping routes were created. Networks were compartmentalized further. Trusted insiders shielded him from direct exposure. Yet every arrest and seizure increased the likelihood of a larger investigation. Despite federal pressure and mafia attempts to retaliate, Frank's influence remained strong. Dealers continued to order Blue Magic. Purity and delivery remained consistent. Profits remained predictable. Loyalty in the streets was transactional, not emotional. The mafia's traditional tactics were ineffective. Frank had replaced them without firing a shot. By 1975, the mafia understood an undeniable truth. Their monopoly on heroin was broken. Violence and tradition could not restore control. The streets now depended on Frank Lucas. He had done what no one else could: quietly and efficiently replace an entrenched criminal empire. But even genius has limits. Expansion increased visibility. Larger cash flows left evidence. Multiple cities meant more exposure points. Frank had outsmarted the mafia, but he now faced a system that could not be ignored: federal law enforcement. He had created dependency, but dependency alone could not protect him from the long arm of the law. By the mid-1970s, Frank Lucas's empire could no longer remain invisible. Blue Magic dominated Harlem and expanded into Newark, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. Millions of dollars in cash flowed through his operation each month. Shipments were consistent, purity was high, and the distribution system was unprecedented. Federal authorities began connecting the dots. DEA agents, IRS investigators, and federal narcotics officers noticed patterns. Shipments from Southeast Asia. Financial flows linked to Frank's network. The same product dominating multiple markets. For the first time, Frank's operational brilliance drew attention he could not avoid. By now, the mafia had lost its grip on heroin distribution. Violence and intimidation were irrelevant. Frank never challenged them directly. Bribery had no effect. supply bypassed traditional mafia routes. Territory was meaningless. Dealers and users were loyal to the product, not the boss. The mafia could do nothing but observe Frank consolidate power, silently and efficiently. Even the best systems have weak points. Couriers were arrested in New Jersey and New York. Shipments were seized at ports. Associates were pressured to cooperate with authorities. Frank responded strategically. Networks were compartmentalized further. Alternative shipping routes were established. Trusted insiders insulated him from exposure. The empire remained intact, but the first cracks were forming. Law enforcement was patient, methodical, and relentless, unlike the mafia. In 1975, Frank Lucas was arrested at his New Jersey home. Federal agents seized large sums of cash, records linking him to heroin importation, evidence of multi-city distribution networks. For the first time, Frank faced a system he could not outsmart: the federal government. Unlike street rivals, the law had patience, resources, and authority. Even his intelligence and planning could not make him untouchable. Faced with decades in prison, Frank had one choice: leverage information. He provided details on supply chains, couriers, and corrupt officials. He revealed logistics and distribution networks. He negotiated for a reduced sentence. It was not betrayal, it was survival. By cooperating, he protected himself and reduced his exposure, but it came at the cost of dismantling his empire. With Frank's cooperation, couriers were arrested or disappeared. Shipments were intercepted. Networks that had once spanned multiple cities collapsed. The mafia never regained control. Blue magic was gone from Harlem. The streets adapted. Frank's empire, built without permission and maintained with brilliance, disappeared almost overnight. Frank Lucas had achieved what no one else could. He dismantled a decades-old mafia monopoly. He built a multi-city operation. He replaced fear with efficiency and dependence. But the price was enormous. Independence lost. Authority evaporated. Reputation fractured. Even genius could not escape the consequences of federal law. Frank's rise and fall illustrate key truths. Efficiency can outsmart violence until law enforcement intervenes. Supply is power, but visibility is vulnerability. Independence is formidable, but survival may require compromise. Even brilliant systems have limits when faced with consequence. He had replaced the mafia, but the empire that made him king could not withstand the law. After Frank Lucas's arrest and cooperation with federal authorities, his empire disappeared almost overnight. Couriers were arrested. Distribution networks dissolved. Blue magic vanished from Harlem and other cities. The streets adapted quickly, as they always do. But the discipline, reliability, and influence Frank had imposed were gone. He had replaced the mafia, yet he could not outlast the law indefinitely. Frank served a reduced prison sentence because of his cooperation. He survived rivals, avoided violent death, and outlasted the mafia's control. But survival came at a cost. Independence lost. Authority over the streets gone. Reputation fractured in some circles. Even in freedom, the streets were no longer his to command. Power had limits, and law enforcement was ultimate authority. Frank's genius had never relied on violence or fear. Dealers and users remembered the product Blue Magic for its purity, consistency, and profitability. The mafia learned a critical lesson: their monopoly could be bypassed. Federal authorities learned that a single man could build a multi-city heroin empire. Frank's legacy was structural. He had rewritten how heroin could move through a city without relying on traditional criminal hierarchies. Frank Lucas's story illustrates uncomfortable truths about power. intelligence and efficiency can outperform tradition and violence. Controlling supply is the ultimate source of influence in street economies. Independence is powerful, but law and consequence are unavoidable. Survival often requires compromise, even for the most brilliant operators. He replaced the mafia not with guns, but with systems. He survived because he understood cause, effect, and consequence. Frank never glorified violence or addiction. He acknowledged the damage his empire caused to communities. Yet he remained analytical. He understood the system he replaced. He understood the rules he ignored. He understood the consequences he could not avoid. He knew that replacing the mafia was possible. But surviving afterward required strategy, intelligence, and pragmatism. By the time Frank Lucas died in 2019, Harlem was no longer under his control. The mafia's influence had vanished. Federal law had reasserted authority. His empire was gone. Yet his story remains a lesson in audacity, strategy, and systemic intelligence. He ruled not through fear or intimidation, but by outsmarting the system and surviving the consequences. Frank Lucas went from nobody to Kingpin. He replaced the mafia's monopoly. He built a multi-city operation. He created dependency without confrontation. He survived longer than almost all rivals. But even genius has limits. Independence is fragile. Intelligence can be challenged by law and time. The cost of running without permission is inevitable. Frank Lucas's name remains legendary. His methods are studied, and his story is a cautionary tale. In the shadows of a city, power is not what you take, it is what you can sustain.